In this podcast, we will discuss agriculture in Europe in the 17th century with focus on the lives of peasants. For peasants, the idea of progress was not embraced because it seemed only possible for the elite. Peasants had no time for big dreams such as progress. They were busy supporting Europe's agrarian economy. Despite their constant work, their output was low due to archaic farming methods and bad weather. Peasants often had to live off of famine foods like chestnuts, bark, grass, and even humans because of food shortages. This left people weak and at the mercy of illness. Before advancements in agricultural methods, the lives of peasants were greatly worsened by food shortages.
The greatest accomplishment by European peasants in the medieval times was the open field system. This system allowed land to be managed by a common agreement by a local community or villages. The system divided land into large fields, then further divided the fields into long, narrow strips. These strips were then given to peasants to be cultivated. Even with this great system, soil exhaustion was an ever-present problem. The only way to resolve this problem was to leave arable land fallow to recover its fertility. This brought a new farming system called rotating field crops, which called for years of farming followed by a year of fallow. The villages also had common lands which were set aside for community uses. These lands were set aside for animals as well as for hay and natural pastures. The European peasants, even with developing agricultural methods, suffered due to unjust labor and tax system. The Eastern European peasants suffered immensely due to lack of heavy limitations on forced labor and serfdom. The peasants in the Western Europe were better off than those in the Eastern Europe. By the 18th century, most Western European peasants were free of serfdom, and some even owned land. However, they suffered due to poverty. Only way for peasants to improve their lives was to take properties from those who owned but did not work. However, forces of higher classes crushed any protests. In order to produce more food, peasants tried to increase cultivation by using idle fallow land by crop rotation. It was found that fallows were unnecessary if grain crops alternated with nitrogen-storing crops, such as peas, beans, root crops, and grasses. Improved farming allowed more fodder for animals, which meant more meat to people, as well as more manure for fertilizer. More and more people wanting to experiment with agricultural system necessitated ending to the open field system, and thus called for enclosement of the fields. Enclosing the open fields meant the disappearance of common land. And knowing these consequences, small landowners and village poor opposed these changes. Due to these oppositions, the enclosure process slowly and for a long time, enclosed and open fields coexisted in Europe.
By the middle of the 17th century, the Dutch employed enclosed fields, continuous crop rotation, and heavy manuring in their farms. This led the Low Countries to be the most advanced farming region in all of Europe. There were two reasons for this. First was a dense population in the Low Countries. The Dutch became efficient farmers in order to be able to feed themselves. In addition, the Dutch were able to turn marshes and swamps into farmable land. This created more jobs for their dense population. The second reason was the growth of towns and cities. Dutch peasant farmers could now sell their output in good markets. Regions could also specialize in what they did best due to better available markets. The English made numerous strides in advancing their agriculture, some with the help of the Dutch. Since large areas in Holland had once been sea and sea marsh, the Dutch were experts in drainage and water control. These experts or engineers helped England drain many of its marshes. The most famous Dutch engineer was Cornelius Vermuyden. He helped convert 40,000 acres of English land into land suitable for farming. English innovator Jethro Tull was also pivotal in improving English farming practices. He advocated the use of horses instead of oxen for plowing. He was also a supporter of sowing seed with drilling equipment instead of by hand. This distributed seed in a more optimal manner. At the same time, English country gentlemen selectively bred even faster horses. All these improvements led to English farmers producing 300% more food than they had in 1700. This was despite only a 14% increase in people farming land.
The existing social structure in England before enclosures consisted mainly of big landowners and peasant farmers. Big landowners aimed for higher yields so they could raise the rent and use the money to invest in technology. They had initiative and drive, strengths that were arguably lacking in smaller conservative farmers. While some said these big farmers split land fairly with small landowners, Most agree that large landowners had control over Parliament, which they used to unfairly gain more land. Parliament passed enclosure acts to allow fencing and division of common land based on how much property one had in open fields. These landowners had the money necessary to pay for the legal and surveying costs of enclosure. Peasant farmers, on the other hand, did not have the money to pay for enclosure and often had to sell out to pay the expenses. Though they originally had access to common pastures, this was lost once enclosure began. Many peasant farmers lost land even before enclosure was prevalent because of early enclosure of sheep runs in the 1700s. After enclosure occurred in England, 4 distinct social groups emerged. At the top of the social hierarchy were large landowners, then tenant farmers, below that were independent peasant farmers, and at the bottom of the social structure were landless cottagers. The way the agricultural system worked was large landowners leased land to agents who rented out land to middle-sized farmers, the tenant farmers, who hired landless laborers who worked hard while receiving very few of the profits. Independent peasant farmers worked outside of the system. They worked on their own land but could not compete when it came to prices. Many independent farmers became tenant farmers, an important group in terms of agricultural progress. Tenant farmers were important in making new technology popular. They're among the first to use fences, drains, and fertilizer. They also created jobs by eliminating the fallow and by growing crops that needed more laborers to care for them. The major significance of enclosure was the effects on landless laborers. The group who was in the worst position were these cottagers. They lost their common rights and access to land. This caused an increase in market-based estate agriculture and the formation of a landless and rural working class. They lost their independence and began to depend on wages. This was the biggest example of proletarianization, this changing of small farmers into landless workers, at the time in Europe.